Nora Silver Moon's on
Awesome.
in the waiting room.
Okay, so the streaming appears to be going. Maybe Heather, could you check YouTube and just see if you can see it? I could see it on mine.
Nora, I have a question. Do you want moderators to keep their camera on, or?
It's not necessary, Nish. We might just need you to just what we just want to be aware of disruptors if there are any, to quickly turn videos off if there's something inappropriate. So I guess that's what I would love for you to kind of keep an eye on. Whoever's quickest to the turn video off.
Okay, sure.
Except you can't shut me off, Nishi.
Oh, I know that.
Judge is the judge is the judge.
Until someone tells you you're not, right? Hi, Mary.
Yeah, she can't unmute herself even. Look, I can.
How are you?
Oh, there she goes.
Great. How you doing?
Good. Sorta. You know.
Hi, Judge.
Judge.
Hey, guys.
Tim Healy has joined us, Judge. I just want to introduce him. He doesn't have a, I'll ask him to unmute there, but Tim has graciously joined us. He's the current director of the Special Victims Unit in the Rhode Island Attorney General's office here in Providence.
Great. Welcome, Tim. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to be joining and, you know, helping in any way I can. So yeah, I'm excited. Yeah.
And thank you for the work you do.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Heather says it's working. So
Admit everybody.
all right, let's go ahead. We have 15 people waiting. I'm sure people will file in probably until about 10 or 15 after.
Are we ready to go? Wigwus in the Tawamag, Ka Nitampag, Askata Squamson, Nutuis Nisu Wushuwanag, Two Hawks, Utwatakone, Nin Nahiganset, Ka Nin Vice President to American Indian Law Students Association at Roger Williams University School of Law. Akwani. Good day, family and friends. How are you doing? I am Nisu Wushuwanag, which translates in the English language to Two Hawks. I am Nahiganset, and I am Vice President of the American Indian Law Students Association at Roger Williams University School of Law. And it is my great pleasure and honor to be here today to give the opening remarks for this fantastic symposium, which we trust will be very informative and motivational for our attorney community to strongly consider doing more pro bono work in the regards that will be discussed today. As is appropriate for contemporary times, I just want to take a moment to give a land acknowledgement, which has been drafted by the Roger Williams University Wuchiwami Living Culture Collaborative, and I will share that now. It says, we recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. We acknowledge that Roger Williams University's Bristol and Providence campuses are located within the ancestral homelands of both the Pokanoket tribe and the Narragansett Nation, and that these communities are the original and continuous stewards of these lands. Let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder of our ongoing efforts to reconcile and partner with the Narragansett, Pokanoket, and all of the indigenous peoples whose lands and waters we benefit from today. Having given that land acknowledgement, and as is traditional and appropriate, had the great honor and pleasure of being able to reach out to Chief Darrell Black Eagle Jameson of the Pocasset Pokanoket tribe, Eagle Clan Chief, who was also a state constable for the state of Rhode Island, to give some words of greeting. And then Chief Black Eagle was also a head of the Eastern Medicine Singers Drum, which is an Algonquin drum group that I'm also a member of. And he gave permission for the drum group to share a welcoming song. The title of the song is Wabon. It's in the Nipmuc dialects, which is one of the Aboriginal nations of these lands. And it loosely translates to carry my prayers on the four winds to Creator. For anyone who's familiar with the Southeastern Algonquian dialects of New England, Manitou is a translation to spirit and is often used to acknowledge the great spirit or the creator above, or in more contemporary language, God. So at this time, we will turn it over for that presentation from Chief Black Eagle and the performance by the Eastern Medicine Singers Drum. And once again, Katapatush Wutia Chusuta, thank you for listening for all who are intended today. And I do hope that you enjoy this very important symposium that we are about to begin.
How you doing, everybody? My name is Darrell Black Eagle Jameson, Suki Wamsakuk in our language. I'm head of the Eastern Medicine Singers, and I'm also the Eagle Clan Chief of the Pocasset Pokanoket. And I'd like to say hello to everybody, and I'd like to promote this new program that's going on to help Indigenous people and domestic violence. And I'd like to ask all the attorneys out there, especially the ones that I personally know, because I'm a state constable for the state of Rhode Island, and I'm fully behind supporting this program. Please support this. Help. Do the pro bono work. Help these people out. A lot of them have no means to get assistance. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate that. And I'm here to do my part as a state constable. I'll be more than happy to help a lot of these people out. So from the Eastern Medicine Singers to you, we're asking for your help. Aho and thank you. Akwani, Kana Hanashek, Nakis Kowetatium, Wakia Nak. Peace and farewell till we meet again. Aho. Yo, Evan,
All right.
Chief Judge McConnell. You're on mute.
Thank you all and welcome, and special thanks to the Eastern Medicine Singers. That was quite a grounding way to begin this session. So in 2018, the Pro Bono Work to Empower and Represent Power Act became law. The law charges each federal jurisdiction to sponsor an annual program to educate bar members and encourage pro bono work for underserved populations, including with and for victims of sexual and domestic violence. Every other year, the Act requires a second program is mandated to focus attention on the unique issues of the Indigenous population in our district. In April, we were scheduled for our first event partnering with Ray Watson and the newly established American Indian Law Students Association at Roger Williams University School of Law, with support from the Roger Williams Pro Bono Collaborative and the United States Attorney's Office. Unfortunately, as is the case these days, pandemic deferred our efforts until now, but in many ways we're better off because of it. The goal of today's symposium is to begin a conversation and learn about what the issues are in order for one to aid another, but particularly in the delivery of pro bono legal services. Lawyers are best served by first learning about the culture, traditions, communication style, and issues impacting or affecting our particular clients. Let's remember, folks, that courts are the great equalizer. The judicial branch gives voice to the voiceless, the unrepresented, and the forgotten by the majority. This is our goal, and this is our mission. It is our hope that in putting together this panel of experts and advocates, we will become more aware and may begin to see where we can all lend a hand. As the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg so aptly said, quote, "Lawyers have a license to practice law, a monopoly on certain services. But for that privilege and status, lawyers have an obligation to provide legal services to those without the wherewithal to pay, to respond to needs outside themselves, and to help repair tears in their community." Thank you so much to our presenters, Ray Watson, Assistant United States Attorney Stacey Veroni, Professor Diamond, and Shana Bullock. Thank you particularly and sincerely to Raina Smith from our clerk's office, whom we would not have this great collaboration. And thank you all for attending. Now I'll turn it over to Nora Tyre-Wittick, our fabulous clerk of court, for some housekeeping matters. Nora?
Thank you, Chief Judge McConnell, and welcome to everyone. It is really a great thing to see everyone in the waiting room and know people are watching on YouTube. So we really appreciate the support of this really unique and awesome collaboration. I just want to introduce our panelists, but before which I want to just let you know, if you're on the Zoom, you can ask questions of the moderators in the chat box. You will have the option to ask a question to any of the co-hosts, and we'll try to answer the questions as we're going along through the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session where you can use the raise hand icon and we'll call on you and unmute you. Everyone has been muted for the presentation today. So let's get going, right? With our speakers. So our first speaker, and I'll just introduce them all so that I don't have to interrupt, but Stacey Veroni is an assistant United States attorney who has had over 25 years of experience as the head of the domestic violence unit for the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, and in her current position with the United States Attorney's Office in Providence, Rhode Island. Professor James Diamond is an adjunct professor at Roger Williams University. Dr. Diamond is the Dean of Academic Affairs at the National Tribal Trial College. He is the former director of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program's Tribal Justice Clinic and a law professor at the University of Arizona College of Law. Dr. Diamond was a special prosecutor in the Pascua Yaqui Tribal Court in Arizona. And prior to teaching, Dr. Diamond practiced law for 25 years in Connecticut. Shanae Bullock is the founder of and cultural consultant for Mosquito Consulting. Shanae is an enrolled Shinnecock Indian Nation tribal member and descendant of the Montauk tribe in Long Island, New York. Shanae is a historian, an activist, a preservationist, and a traditionalist. She has over 12 years of experience as an Indigenous perspective historian and has worked at many accredited Indigenous museums, such as the Shinnecock Indian Museum and Cultural Center, the Plymouth Plantation, and Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. We are so honored to have all of them here with us today to share their experience and expertise. And without further ado, Stacey, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for asking me to participate in this important panel discussion today. As Nora indicated, I am an assistant United States attorney, and I've been with the Providence office here, the Rhode Island District, for just over a year, having come from the state of Rhode Island prosecution for the past almost 26 years. I come to you today to share my experiences with you and to talk to you about this thing, this issue of domestic violence that affects all individuals. It affects us, even if we're not thinking of it, or if we're not identifying with someone who is a victim or thinks that they don't know someone who's a victim. And hopefully to tell you a little bit about domestic violence to get you interested and to get you involved. When I started at the Attorney General's office 26 years ago, I didn't have a burning passion to assist and prosecute domestic violence cases. If you think I'm old, if you think way back to the early 90s when I started, domestic violence was in prosecution of these cases. It was new. Cases were routinely dismissed based on the facts that victims didn't show up, or the victim came in and signed an affidavit of non-prosecution. And it was rare to see an actual victim who would cooperate or a prosecutor who would attempt to go to trial without the cooperation of a witness. My, have we come a long way. As I stated before, when I first started, there wasn't that burning passion. And when an opening became available in the domestic violence unit, it was a little bit of, do you want to go, but you're going. And I welcomed the opportunity, not because, this was my issue, but because this was the place that a young trial lawyer or prosecutor was going to gain the experience to move up to the more important cases. There are no other more important cases. And I want to hopefully bring my experiences to you and share with you why you should be thinking along those lines, and hopefully to inspire you to do this really important work. When you work with a domestic violence victim, I can tell you that these are some of the most remarkable and strong individuals. And our goal in the criminal justice system as prosecutors, but I think all of our goal is to get these victims to not be victims, but to become survivors. And I know that Professor Diamond's going to talk about this a little bit later. But one of the most important things that we have in this system, in our society, is, sure, the courts are important, but there are advocates and our independent resources for victims of domestic violence. Our shelters, like the Coalition Against Domestic Violence member agencies and Sojourner House. And that's where the people who are boots on the ground doing this work, and we're asking you essentially to become a part of that and explain why it's so important. So we're talking about it now. I'm not an expert on American Indian law. That's where Shanae will come in and Professor Diamond will come in. But my purpose and background here is to talk to you about the honor of doing this type of work for survivors. In order to understand what you're getting into when you're, thinking about taking on a case that involves someone who has been victimized, a victim of domestic violence, you have to really understand that, it's not a one-time incident. It's something that's been a pattern of behavior, a cycle of behavior, and the way that person is going to react to services, the court, their own attorney, is really shaped and molded by these past experiences. So we're going to talk about, what happens in these relationships, and a lot of them come to light and come to lawyers' offices because there has been a criminal event, because someone has been arrested and there's been a prosecution in the case, but certainly not always. And the criminal justice system at the state and federal level isn't going to solve or fix those victims' problems. That's where you come in, and that's where the experts, our resources, our shelters, and our coalition come in. But in order to kind of understand your interactions, you have to realize what's going on in these relationships. And hopefully we're going to address a couple of things today: the cycle of violence and the dynamics of domestic violence. We're going to talk in very simple terms about why abusers abuse and why victims stay in abusive relationships. And I'm going to just actually make one comment about why victims stay in abusive relationships, and that's where you come in. The victims, many of them, lack resources, and their concern isn't a criminal case. Their concern is their safety, the custody of their children, and their ability to legally leave their offender. So that's one of the reasons, but we'll explore all of those. So as Chief Judge McConnell stated, the purpose of this training, the purpose is twofold: to get you involved in a mandate or requirement. So when you saw me, you were probably saying, what is a federal prosecutor doing talking about these cases? I'm pleased that Tim Healy from the Attorney General's office is on as well with us and is a great and tremendous resource. The reality of it is, it's the state courts and tribal courts, not the federal courts, that are handling these types of cases that come through the system. So I want to, again, talk about why abusers abuse, but I want to hopefully dispel some of the myths of domestic violence. If you don't have a background, you've probably heard things like this, that a victim deserves the abuse, or that a victim can provoke the abuse. You've probably heard, or you think maybe, that men could never be the victims of domestic violence. A myth that is frequently perpetrated, and I say this, I'll address it in a moment, is that all abusers are mentally ill. We certainly have individuals with mental illness in the justice system as defendants, and certainly as victims. We'll talk about that, but this isn't, the root of domestic violence is not mental illness. Another myth that abusers snap or simply lose control. And we know from our own interactions with individuals on a day-to-day basis that the using violence against another individual is a choice to use violence against another individual. Coupled with the myth of abusers abuse only when they're high and drunk, because that's certainly, it is a factor in some of these relationships, but not it's not the root or cause of domestic violence. So what is domestic violence? It's plain and simple. It's human behavior that's been accepted for so long in our society. And it is perpetrated, it is cyclical, and it's learned behavior. Casey Gwynn, who is a former city attorney for the city of San Diego, I think said it best. We grow our abusers at home. So we grow our criminals at home, and the cycle of violence continues. How serious and how, statistically, how much does this affect us in society? Every 9 seconds, a woman is the victim of domestic violence. Statistically reported cases of domestic violence, in excess of 80% of victims are women. 1 in 3 women will become the victim of domestic violence at some point in their lifetime. And we'll talk about the forms of domestic violence, but this statistic actually relates to the physical violence. And 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced some sexual violence at some point in their lives. And on average, 4 women are murdered in this country every day as victims of domestic violence. That's why we should care. The people that are seeking emergency medical services are victims of domestic violence. 33% approximately of those individuals who seek emergency medical services. And the leading cause of injury to women between the ages of 15, girls and women between the ages of 15 and 44, it's not stranger danger that we're so accustomed to hearing. It's not a stranger robbery. It's domestic violence. Women are more likely to become abused or victims at the hands of their partners. So I just wanted to kind of start off with those and kind of hopefully dispel those myths of domestic violence and talk about and talk more. So I've given you those statistics, and those should be basically with you on the website. I did have a PowerPoint presentation, and we'll certainly send that out to you. The actual monetary cost of intimate partner violence exceeds $5 billion each year, and that's for treatment and services for individuals, and including mental health services, as well as hospitalizations. When I talk to you about where you can come in and talk to you about the need for representation of women, not over 20% of women who are reported victims of domestic violence have indicated that at some point in time, they've lost a job as a result of being a victim, because they've been unable to go to work because of physical injury, unable to go to work because of emotional injury. And those are the reasons that we all need, and these victims need your help. I'm not going to go through a litany or a list of statewide statistics, but I just want to kind of give you this number. In 2019, the Coalition Against Domestic Violence reported that there were over 15,000, sorry about that, 15,000 calls of reports to domestic violence hotlines. I just kind of want to put that out there. With over 7,000 interventions by police and over 5,000 arrests in 2019. But again, too, that arrest, usually it's not something that's really the choice of the victim. The police are called in, and it's to stop. What they want is not to become immersed or involved in the criminal justice system. What they want is for the violence to stop. And regardless of a case going down the road, they're in need of your services immediately, not once the case is over. The domestic violence unit for the state, advocacy services within prosecutors' offices, they do a wonderful and they do a tremendous job, but they can't help with housing for victims. They're not going to be able to help and join in with that victim in her custody battle against her abuser. They're not going to be able to jump in and help to get them money to get on their feet and sustain them for any lengthy period of time. Sure, there are emergency services, but that's why they need your help. Why does this domestic violence continue? Because we've tolerated it for so long in society. And I want you to think for a moment about change in behavior. These children are growing up watching and learning domestic violence and becoming the abusers of our future. When you learn, you're learning through observation. And when your family accepts abusive relationships in their lives, young women and young men are more willing to accept it, a sense of normalcy as to how a relationship is supposed to go or be seen by others. In particular, teen violence victims, with very little relationship experience, but what they've learned at home from their parents. It's learned through observation. It's learned through experience and reinforcement. It's learned in the culture. And I know Shanae is going to talk about cultural issues and domestic violence. And some cultures are more tolerant of abusive behaviors or have a hierarchy as to where women belong in society or what the role of the woman is in society. It's learned in family and it's, and it's reinforced in certain peer groups and professions. And that's a whole other day of talking about what domestic violence is. Who are the batterers? We've seen it all. I think everyone, perhaps that's on this call today, I would hope that you recognize that when I gave that statistic of 1 in 3, if you're in a public place and you look around you, chances are you know someone who's been the victim of domestic violence. And if nothing else, if you came to this meeting today to get your CLE credit, I just want you to hopefully realize that and realize kind of the forms of how domestic violence can appear to others. But we've seen people from, and hopefully this will assist you in dispelling any myths, from all walks of life, from all cultures, from all professions, from all backgrounds. I need not list those there. The ones that you'll see that are publicized are individuals where there's an important case that's going on, or it involves celebrities. And those cases are important to bring the issue, but for every one of those cases, there are tens of thousands of victims who haven't contacted police, who can't feel that they can leave the relationship and have no resources, and they need you. But the point of that is offenders exist in all races, ethnicities, and ages. Again, too, it takes in the state system approximately 12 to 18 months for a case to go through the system. Those victims need your help right now. When you see a domestic violence victim, these are some of the most difficult cases to prosecute. Again, too, because they don't want to be involved in the system, but also because there's oftentimes a continuing relationship with the abuser. There are children involved. There are dynamics in the relationship that only that victim can really relate to. And you have to have a basic understanding of that. Again, housing issues, child support, custody, ability to work on their own. Poverty and inability to work is a barrier to women leaving abusive relationships. I want to talk to you about the forms of domestic violence. So what's going on in these relationships? Unlike the healthy relationship where there's dialogue, disagreements, and agreements, where there are peaceful resolutions to issues, domestic violence abusers use power and control over their victim in these relationships. when they're losing control over the relationship, that power and control or ways to maintain it can meet or exist in many forms. We think, I think as lawyers, of the physical, because that's something that we're in a profession where at the end of the day, there's judgment, right? And we, as lawyers, we evaluate cases and look at facts. And when you see a bruise or a cut or a black eye or something like that, we can touch that and we can convince ourselves or pass judgment in this particular case. But the things that don't show on the physical side are fear and intimidation, one of the methods to gain control over a victim. I like to always describe it as kind of, what's intimidation? When your mom gives you that look, even at 50 something years old, what's coming next, as far as the conversation. Threats is another way to maintain power and control over your victim, especially when there's been physical violence in the relationship. The simple threat to that person, to a family member, to a child, a threat to the perpetrator that they're going to leave or that they're going to kill themselves. Those are ways to maintain power and control. These victims are always victims of emotional abuse, a third form of domestic violence. And, that's something that we can't see, that we can't touch, but I encourage you to hear it and to feel it. A link to a YouTube video will be posted on the website today. And I'm just going to ask you to take 10 minutes after the presentations to go to that link. It's a story about a victim of domestic violence, and her name is Lola. It's an old tape. It's from the New York State Police. And Lola is abused by her boyfriend, and the police are called, and he is arrested. And just like so many thousands of domestic violence defendants, despite the fact that there's a restraining order in the case, what does he do? He goes right back home. And again, that's where help is needed. And he goes right back home. And this video, which is just the words that are spoken, captures the audio, and it's not a conversation, it's abuse, the audio abuse and emotional abuse that Lola went through. And I pointed out to you now that when you watch it, there's nothing physical about it. When you listen to this 10 minutes, he doesn't hit her. And I think that that's a good way to kind of visualize and conceptualize what's going on in these relationships. When someone tells you that you're worthless, that you're ugly, that you're fat, you begin to believe that you're not worthy, you're ugly, that you're fat. And victims will oftentimes think, I don't have any place else to go, I'm dependent on this person, and that emotional abuse and ability to keep someone in the relationship is maintained by that emotional abuse. Economic abuse, I push that, and I've said it before, I'm going to push it again. A lot of these victims are victims of economic abuse. They don't control the purse strings. Remember, there's not equality in a lot of these relationships. Isolation is another tactic or method of keeping victims in control by abusers. When you start off in a relationship, in healthy relationships, some sense of isolation or some isolation takes place, and it takes place naturally. It takes place naturally because you like the person and you're interested in them. And oftentimes you stop seeing on a regular basis the individuals that you were friendly with.
It's less than it was, right? Yeah, exactly.
I'm just getting a little feedback here. The individuals that you were related to, family members and friends, which are a tremendous resource for our victims. When you're isolated and you stop seeing your family and friends, they stop calling as well. So that's that tendency to isolate. I've seen it to the extreme where individuals have taken, under the promise of a better job, a move to a different state. And when that victim finally becomes comfortable with their church or members of the community, they move yet again. Sexual abuse is a form of maintaining power and control over an individual as well. And I stress again that men can be the victims of sexual violence as well. You know, what does it look like when a victim experiences domestic violence? They can suffer from so many things. The emotional effects of domestic violence. And I want you to think again too, how cyclical this is. And if you're thinking, okay, it's a women's issue, it's not. It's a women's issue, it's a child's issue, it's a man's issue. Many of our victims, because of that emotional abuse, will suffer from low self-esteem, erratic mood swings, they're self-critical, they suffer long-term depression, including suicidal thoughts and acts. And that carries over to our children, because our kids, right, see that and experience that. And, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, my presentation and kind of giving you the areas in which you can help. If you've got criminal law or law experience, some of the best work that I saw as a prosecutor from defense attorneys was interventions by attorneys before a case even got charged formally. So if the case was going to Superior Court as a felony, take that time, you know, with that victim. If you're able to represent and knowing that there's this history of abuse, to present that to the prosecutor. It may be a self-defense case. It might be a case that is deserving of some mitigation. So that's an area on the criminal side that these victims need your help. You'll oftentimes see victims become involved as well in the family court system with charges of abuse or charges of neglect. Because when you can't get out of bed in the morning and you know you're hurt and you're self-medicating, you're not taking care of your kids. And so it's, again, a societal issue and a family issue. On victims of domestic violence, really powerful. I think that we can all kind of appreciate when we were in law school, because we've got some students here, and we're studying all night for our final exams, not even because of the physical, but because of that emotional abuse and being screamed at, are unable to perform or unable to function. They become victims of physical difficulties, lowered resistance to viruses and flus, headaches and ulcers, insomnia. I could go on and on. They have effects in their cognitive thinking that we spoke about, and certainly they have difficulty when you're in these relationships recognizing the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship. You know, I've seen both extremes, unwilling to give someone a chance, thinking that, okay, it's going to be just like the next, and then the cycle of, you know, this is what happens in those types of relationships. And it has impact on sexual intimacy. Why do victims stay in these relationships? You need to understand it, and I hope that Shanae will be able to talk to us about that. Sometimes they won't seek help at all because of different life experiences. Maybe it's culturally that they're afraid of the police. Maybe it's their religious beliefs. And a really powerful tool to maintain power and control over a victim is the threat of immigration and threat of authorities as it pertains to immigration issues. So those are some issues with respect to individuals with cultural considerations, different life experiences and social systems, and language as well. So any of you that are pro bono, we certainly could use, these victims could certainly use the services of individuals who speak other languages as well. I mentioned that children are more likely to tolerate abuse in their homes, and children are more likely to get hurt in their own homes, because when there's domestic violence going on in the home, there's more likely to be child abuse that's going on in the home. And whether or not it's child abuse directly from a parent, purposeful direction at the child, we'll oftentimes see children, especially teenage children, get hurt by being involved in the physicality, trying to separate their mom and dad or the boyfriend and girlfriend. And we'll see those kids becoming affected. And 80% of runaways have been affected by domestic violence. To our family court attorneys that are thinking of maybe doing some pro bono work, I think that one of the scariest things that victims have talked to me about as part of the process is the prospect of walking into the family court where they really need to go to get a restraining order and the like. There are resources through the state courts, an advocate to go with the victim to help fill out their restraining order. But it's remarkable the impact that it has on the victim when that partner or that spouse shows up with a lawyer on the other side, and all too often they are not represented, because that's not where the criminal courts get involved. And do they need your help? Well, yes. When we're dealing with family court issues, I've heard before and people have said, well, he's not that bad of a guy. He doesn't abuse his kids. Most of the children in domestic violence homes, 15.5 million a year, hear, know that domestic violence is going on. So approximately 70% of our children are experiencing this themselves. And so when it comes time to decide issues of custody, and the victim is in need of someone to kind of present that for them, listen and listen to their stories, and don't be afraid to take on these remarkable and difficult cases. So these kids know what's going on. And just like victims, direct victims, spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands and wives, these kids who are exposed to domestic violence suffer similar physical types of threats and ailments, low self-esteem, self-medicating. I want to kind of talk to you just for a moment about about judgment, right? I've said it, and I know we're going to concentrate on the Indigenous. They're going to concentrate on the Indigenous population, and I've mentioned to you that poverty is a factor in a lot of these relationships, but it's not the poor. It's anyone, and they have their own unique and individual reasons for staying in these relationships. And you kind of have to dig that out when you're dealing with a victim of this type of violence, because they're not going to come out with it. It's not something that they want to talk about. These are the deepest, darkest, most upsetting circumstances. And that's going to affect the way that they interact with you, the strength that they have maybe in a court process. And you simply need to understand that as we go through. So please be mindful. Just want to check the time. I don't know how much time I have left. Please be mindful that we need you in all of these areas, in representation of maybe criminal offenders through the volunteer lawyer program from the Bar Association, immigration, as well as child support and custody. Although there's been a bit of a pause in it, the eviction process and housing, because those are the issues that victims need to address before they can truly become survivors and have, hopefully, if they're strong enough to do it, to have a tremendous impact as a peer of someone else who finds themselves in a domestic violence situation. So, let's not judge. Everyone, again, has their unique reasons for staying in abusive relationships. We have to understand that and come to terms with that, and not judge as a result of that, because no one deserves the abuse. When you're meeting with a potential client, I just want to leave you with 5 things to say to a domestic violence victim as they maybe embark on a legal process with you. You're it. You're their resource and you're their help. Sarah Buell, who's an attorney in Massachusetts who concentrated on domestic violence cases and work, I fear for your safety. I fear for the safety of your children. It will get worse because it does. We've seen it and experienced it. I have as a prosecutor. I'll be here to help you. And as simple as it sounds, to remind someone that they don't deserve the abuse. So again, I'm thrilled to have been a part of this panel discussion today. I don't know what I have left at time or if I've run out of time, but I'll be on and eager to hear from Shanae and Professor Diamond and available for any questions.
Thank you, Stacy. Professor Diamond, I'll turn it over to you. You're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And I want to say thank you to Judge McConnell for putting this panel together. I know that the Congress says that you're supposed to do it, but you didn't have to put together such a good one. And thanks for inviting me to speak and my students who have invited me, my law students. So I am teaching federal Indian law at Roger Williams University Law School. So thanks to the faculty and the deans for offering that class at Roger Williams University Law School. I do that part-time. My full-time job is I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs at the National Tribal Trial College. And let me tell you what we do related to this problem. We train, for the most part, we train survivors of violence, Native women mostly, who are survivors of violence, sexual violence and domestic violence. We train them to be advocates in domestic and sexual violence cases. We put on a 6-month program in law, and then we have a boot camp where we have them getting up and making arguments and opening arguments and doing trials once a year. And we train them to be lay advocates. Now, Judge McConnell talked about the purpose of this program to help lawyers do pro bono work for underserved populations. And let me tell you that the Native American population, we can refer, sometimes we say Native American, and sometimes we say Indian, and sometimes we say Indigenous population is underserved when it comes to legal services. Now, we're going to think outside the box a little bit and think outside of Rhode Island, because here in Rhode Island and in Connecticut, Massachusetts, you do have state courts handling domestic violence cases. But when it comes to tribal victims, Indian offenders, in the rest of the country, you're going to see these cases being handled in tribal courts. So let's talk about tribal courts a little bit. Really, I want my lawyer friends to think about being creative in how you can help this underserved population. So there are 574 federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States, almost 600. There are some 200 tribal court systems within the United States with indigenous sovereignty. They are handling domestic violence cases. There is no federal mandate, there is no state mandate to provide legal representation for defendants in criminal cases in tribal court. In most instances, there's no civil legal services divisions. So this is a population desperately in need of help. So what I'm going to ask you to do is give some thought. Is there a tribal court that you can volunteer for? Now, in tribal court, I'm asking you for you to be creative. You don't have to do what I did. In 2012, I closed down a busy law office in Fairfield County, Connecticut, and I went to the University of Arizona and got a doctoral degree in Indigenous law. I then became the director of the Indian Law Clinic at the University of Arizona Law School. And now I teach women how to be advocates. You don't have to do all that, okay? But you can perhaps think, is there an Indian tribe I can help? Maybe right here in Rhode Island with the Narragansett tribe. Maybe in Massachusetts with the Aquinnah tribe, the Mashpee tribe. Maybe in New York State, upstate New York, Onondaga, Seneca, St. Regis Mohawk. Maybe in Connecticut, the Mashantucket Pequots and the Mohegans. Is there a tribal court where I can help? Now, I went and got admitted to a few tribal courts. And, it was just a little bit of work. I had to study for one bar exam. And it was just a few hours of work. And then I'm able to help those in tribal courts. Maybe there's a law clinic nearby that's working for tribes. In Boston, at Suffolk Law School, there's an Indigenous law clinic. There are Indigenous law clinics at the University of Arizona, at ASU, University of Colorado, and many others. Many tribes could use your help in just drafting code, in writing domestic violence code. Tribes that don't have them, it requires some effort. It requires some study. It requires talking to people, in those communities and asking, how can I help? Like I said, we train women to be lay advocates. In tribal court, you don't have to be a lawyer to speak up on behalf of a victim, to be a victim advocate. You don't have to be a lawyer. In fact, you don't have to be a lawyer to represent a client in tribal court. So maybe you can do what I do and help train, as a lawyer, help train lay advocates to be active in tribal communities. This is a crisis. Stacy is a very hard act to follow. Very, very eloquent in presenting to you what the problems are. But when we talk about Native women, 46% of all Native women experience some kind of physical abuse by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 3 will be sexually assaulted. That's a low estimate, okay? Native women, sadly, are murdered at 10 times the national average. This is a crisis. There's also a crisis in the patchwork of jurisdiction, how these cases are handled. Because outside of the Northeast, state courts do not have jurisdiction over Indian offenders. Tribal courts do. There's no tribal court criminal jurisdiction at all over non-Indian offenders in most places. There's less Indian country here in the Northeast, but out in the rest of the country, it is a crisis. You do have federal jurisdiction in major crimes, but the amount of time it takes for federal law enforcement to get to a crime scene, to start investigating and working, means that they need more help. Tribal courts need more resources. Tribal courts need more funding. Tribal courts need your help. Bar associations can do more to establish these kinds of programs to help Native victims, and so can you. If I can be of any help to anyone in directing you to resources for who to contact, where to study, how to get involved, please let me know. We at the National Tribal Trial College, we put on programs for Native police officers, for lay advocates, for judges as well. It is complicated. It is complicated. I do. Judge McConnell mentioned Justice Ginsburg, and I do want to recognize Justice Ginsburg for very, very important work that she did in this area. It's a case called U.S. versus Bryant. Take a look at it, where she talked about the difficulty that Native women face in domestic and sexual violence cases, the complexity of jurisdiction law in Indian law, the lack of resources. State versus Bryant, and she talked about the importance of providing legal services to American Indian tribes. You know, listen, in a lot of ways, Native Americans are the forgotten Americans. And so this is, this is critical. I'm so happy to be on the panel. I'm so happy that we're talking about this here today, and that Roger Williams Law School is teaching the subject. I got a full classroom, hoping to have more and to appear at these programs in the future. It's a crisis, and just asking that you be creative and think, how can you help?
Thank you, Professor Diamond. Shanae, I'm going to find you here and pin your video. Here we are. All right. Go ahead, Shanae.
Okay. Akune, Nadasuisa Kampanayu Mishuna Tuiusqua, Wachi Shinnecock, Wachi Siwanhaki, Wachi Montauk. My given name is I lead canoe. I am Butterfly Woman. And I come from the island known to my people as the Island of Shells, and the island, the Fish Island, known to many of you guys as Long Island, New York. I am enrolled in the Shinnecock Indian Nation, which is located in Southampton, New York. Southampton, New York is the first establishment in the state of New York. And I am also a descendant of the Montauk community. The reason why I say that, I'd like to lead with, just to speak, there's so much to cover, right? The topic, the title of this entire symposium is Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women. There are a lot of domestic and abuse cases, but the missing and murdered part is the real crisis. And so what I'd like to really, talk about, and the way I'm going to talk about it is talking about the importance of women in the world, in our culture, and in our society. And then moving to the historical patterns of it as Indigenous people. Talking about the reality, so I'll get into a little bit of the statistics that have been touched upon by the other panelists. And then I want to talk about the resilience, because a lot of times when we begin to talk about our culture, sometimes I've had experience in public history that it just seems like a lot of dark and bad things that are happening to us. And unfortunately, that is very true. But it's also important to think of the hope and the courage and the resilience that we have as Indigenous peoples. So that's how I'm going to kind of, communicate with you guys listening and watching. So first and foremost, I do want to say thank you so much, especially to Ray Two Hawks, who's a close relative of mine. We're sister tribes. Our tribes are sister tribes. We spoke the same language. We paddled across what we call the pond, known to many of you guys in New England as Long Island Sound. My people were whalers. We were the people that greeted Henry Hudson in Long Island. We were the people that saw Amerigo Vespucci and Verrazano. We are those people, and we are still here. So I want to say thank you also to the Roger Williams University School of Law for having the American Indian Law Association, because I think it's very vital, because the first laws in this country we're dealing with making laws against the way of living for Indigenous peoples right there in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Long Island, and across, the Northeast. So I want to say it's a huge monumental step, I think, for this entire symposium and everyone that we have on it. It's huge. It's a little bigger than just the United States because of the history. And I know, like, a lot of us who are from the Northeast, we're very, very proud of our history and our heritage on both sides. But when we face things today, we kind of have to understand what took place in history to get us to this point and fix those little cracks or big cracks so that we can come to some sort of resolution. So there's a lot of work to do. So just want to say to Boutne, to all of you, for having this and for having me represent all of the Indigenous women and men that have experienced this, that are either no longer here, that are still being searched for by their families, or the families that are actually still searching or are mourning, or those that are in fear of their lives, and those that are also working for, our people and our environment. So the importance of the origin of importance to our community is that women are sacred. Women are very sacred. Why? Because we're very connected to the earth. We carry the children. We reproduce. We are nurturers. We are life stainers, and we are life givers, which is why we are to be protected, which is why we are to be honored, which is why we are in many ways fragile. And this isn't just Native women. This is all women across the world. We're very connected to the earth. We still practice these ceremonies in which we have, moon ceremonies, moon lodges. And why? Because every 28 days, there's a cycle in the universe, right? The moon is full every 28 days. And then on the opposite end of that, or on 14 days, on the opposite end of that, there's a new moon. And so the woman's cycles with that moon, which is a connection that she has to the universe and the earth. And when we respect that connection and we are in harmony with that connection, then everything is balanced. What's happening in this world is that there are missing, murdered, and Indigenous women, which is creating a huge imbalance to the world. The same time we're seeing that the women are missing and murdered, we're also seeing the destruction to the environment as well. So there's a huge connection within that. And these are things that our ancestors have always known. And we've always honored the women. Again, specifically in the Northeast and other cultures, they talk about matriarchal societies. And as matriarchal societies, the main reason why the woman was deemed as head of household, right, or a clan mother, or the woman had the final say, is because she gave life and she sustained and nurtured it. These roles that we do have in our communities, they have been taken from us. And that's where we get into the conversation of historical patterns. In 1608, there was a gentleman named Thomas Hunt who came to the shores in Massachusetts and greeted the Patuxent and the Nauset tribes and the other Massachusetts tribes, and came with, positivity that they would be doing exchange. The natives at the time had been used to seeing English ships come. There were ships just coming during the exploration period in the 1500s. And with that, he came and he enticed them. And I know that there's a huge common word now being used with missing, murdered Indigenous women, saying that a reason is exploitation. So there was an exploitation to this new trade with the English and things. And so there was this trust that was beginning to be had with the English. But Thomas Hunt had a whole different agenda. He kidnapped 24 Massachusetts peoples, as well as, there are accounts that there might be other peoples from either or, New York, but we never put borders between these states. So there were about 24 captives. And there's accounts from John Smith saying that what he did was inhumane. And and the things that had been done. I mean, he literally enticed them and told them that he had trade goods on the ship for them to come and see. The natives came with furs. You know, they didn't expect this to happen to them. And so they were shipped off into slavery. He went down to the Caribbean and began to sell them into slavery. And so when that happened, there was a huge, I guess the word that was utilized in the records was that the natives of the families became very hostile. You know, they became very hostile. 24 of some of their strongest, most loved people were kidnapped in 1608. Why do I bring this up now? And this is the beginning part of the historical patterns conversation, is that, you know, it's very important to see that nothing has quite changed. You know, when I get later into the statistics, you know, notice I said 24. So that's Thomas Hunt. There are murderers out there that have literally individually killed 50 women as one person they have killed. So these patterns haven't changed. There's another account of, as you kind of skip forward, you know, obviously people have their, you know, different historians have their different interpretations of the Mayflower landing. But out of that captivity, there was 2 people that came back. One, Epino, who was actually a Quinawampanoag. And he actually, the way he came back was very differently, but he enticed them. He kind of tricked them in coming back and bringing him back. And he came back and he told them that there was gold on Martha's Vineyard. So that's what allowed, you know, him to get back to his people. And as he got closer to shore, he jumped off and he swam back to his people. That was, you know, these are not, I won't, unfortunately, even though these are very old stories and this is the history of this country, these are very similar stories to what we're hearing today dealing with missing, murdered Indigenous women. Women are vanishing, like literally vanishing. And they're not always vanishing by their, you know, abusers, but they're just vanishing. And then this is happening more frequently. And so as a historian, I think it's very important for me to kind of look more into the histories and the parallels to see where did the laws change? Where did they not change? What needs, you know, what needs the help? And so another captive that actually survived this, most people know him as Squanto. Most people, you know, talk about him, but his real name was Tisquantum. And he came back and he was an interpreter. But I bring that story up because I think it's very important to note that our people they have always been murdered and kidnapped since the point of colonization. And in that weaving of, you know, how this country has kind of begun, you get into relation, right? After the King Philip's War, there was a law that stated, particularly out of Massachusetts. So when we talk about these laws early on, and I'm sure you, all the attorneys on here probably might note, but you know, you had the tribes and then you had the settlements. And then after the Pequot War was the becoming of, or the foundation of, the 4 united colonies: Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, you know, New Haven Colony. Rhode Island, you guys were kind of, you know, not quite in there right away because a lot of people feared the Narragansetts. But at the same time, you know, you had these colonies. So when they began to have these colonies, they created laws. And one of those laws, particularly after the King Philip's War, was that if any child after the age of 13 did not become, you know, Christianized or colonialized, then they would have to immediately, particularly boys, be shipped into slavery. It was a system. It was literally like a whole kill the Indian, save the man. It was a system. And so when we think about these, and these are all laws, these are created laws. When we think about how our culture is today, and not trying to separate it, but the indigenous culture, the native culture, and then we kind of do it by region, because the Northeast, as we just talked about, states jurisdiction versus tribal courts jurisdiction. Why is the Northeast always this like little gray area? Because of the original laws. So what, when you think about that, those original laws were not created by the United States. And they were not signed and agreed upon between the United States and the tribes, because the United States did not exist. The 13 colonies did not quite exist yet. It was the 4 United Colonies. And these are things I like to talk about specifically to people that work in the Northeast, just because sometimes when we think about Native people, we separate the natives that are still there from what's happening in Indian country, because we haven't wrapped our heads around why is it this way? Well, that doesn't really pertain to the natives in the Northeast. Well, then what does? It's a lot bigger than we think it does. The signatories, the original signatories of this country, were between the crown and the indigenous peoples that were here. And so those, they were small agreements and things. And then unfortunately there were wars, the Pequot War, the Kief's War, and the King Philip's War kind of set the tone there in 1676. So right after that, that's when the real serious force of assimilation really began to happen. There was already slavery and indentured servitude happening between 1621 and today. Basically, that was already happening by law in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut, particularly, even in New York. But then you began to have okay, now that they have kind of become, now that we have had, I heard the terms power and control, now that we now have power and control over a community, not a person, a community of people and a culture, now we can begin to put in residential schools, intermarry. I like to also bring up the missing and murdered Indigenous women of that time. Pocahontas, even though there's, the reason why I believe that she is kind of put in the most, she's a big topic in a lot of conversations, particularly talking about, this 17th century, 18th century time periods, is because she's kind of been written about the most. John Smith actually has a lot of large written accounts. So, there's a lot of other women that haven't been discussed. But she was married not by choice. That wasn't a choice. It was kind of an example. She was kind of put into a relationship to marry. And so there are other women too, right there in Rhode Island, Bristol, you have Weetamo. Weetamo was murdered. Her head was put on a stick. She was a leader of her community and she was murdered for, standing up for her people, and doing the things that she had always been taught to do. But because there were laws against her ways of living, they murdered her. The same thing about my ancestor, Quashawam. February 11th, 1664 was the last time that we actually see any kind of record of her. And to this day, as her descendants, we are still in search of her whereabouts after that time period. There isn't a talk of what her death was. There isn't a talk of where she went. There isn't anything after that date. And it was because she literally became the quote unquote grand sachem of all of Long Island. She was the leader at the time. And so, you move into residential schools. Residential schools, we talk about the children. I heard that conversation earlier, and it's very important to note the connection between a woman and a child, right? Because the woman carries the child and she births the child. So there's a strong connection between, that, the mother and the child. And when you take these children at the age of 5, and I've actually read many letters that some of these children have, my ancestors have written, back to either home or their teachers and things like that, that when they were writing what they were experiencing, they were writing about the abuse. They were writing about witnessing the things that were happening to their relatives, to people that they didn't know. These residential schools were set up throughout the country, but one of the largest ones was the Carlisle Indian School. And strategically, there was a railroad that went right literally on the campus of the Carlisle Indian School. And if we really look at how things are set up, a lot of the railroads are very, very, very close to what is now known as Indian reservations or Indian communities. And because they were taking the children from these communities and putting them into these residential schools, they were telling them that they could not speak their language, they had to cut their hair, they were not able to pray in the way that they weren't able to literally be who they were. And the moment that they did that, they were abused. So when this is a learned behavior to not a person, a community and a culture, and you're stripping the child away from the community and the mother and the family, and that has started since the beginning of colonization. Let's fast forward to where we are today in 2020. It's a little emotional, right? Like, didn't think it's very emotional. It's painful to know that this is literally still happening, and we're trying to do everything that we can, but everything is against us. One of the terms that I heard earlier, and I really liked it, Stacey, you had mentioned it. You talked about economic abuse. So right now we're in a time where tribes, there's the destruction period. I've heard different attorneys and policy makers say. Then there's the reconstruction period. Termination and reconstruction. Termination, reconstruction. There's a pattern that we see within the Indian country. It's termination and reconstruction. Termination, reconstruction. Right. The termination was colonization. Right. Smallpox. Biochemical warfare, all of that, genocide, because there weren't really any types of laws that prevented it. Even the day of Thanksgiving, it was John Winthrop that literally said that in November, there will always be a public day of Thanksgiving because of the killings of the Pequots. That is the first place that we see the term Thanksgiving, a public day of Thanksgiving. That's the first place, that's the first record that we see it. And it was because of that. So there was this termination, and then the reconstruction was the residential schools, right? Harvard, Dartmouth, all of these places were actually institutions for our children to go to become assimilated and to become missionaries. And so now, there's always been this question, because a lot of people don't want to talk about it. Where are we at now? Are we in termination? Are we in reconstruction? To be honest, I think it's a little bit of both. Because myself, and I think it's amazing to see my generation, and even Ray Two Hawks, right, to be able to sit on the board for the American Indian Law Association, to be at the Rhode Island, Roger Williams University, to be on such a panel, and to be so educated, to be so eloquent, to be so graceful, and to still have our culture, to still have our language and things like that. That part is the resilient part. The part that becomes very hard, and I guess this is where the conversation of pro bono work or help and resources comes in, is that economical abuse. Because even though we are very educated, we're very smart, we come together, we're very resilient. We now have 2 Native women Congress. That's huge. There are Native judges, there are colleges, there are all these amazingly positions and monumentous and historical things that we're experiencing, but at the same time, it's that economical abuse, because we do not have the economical sustainability to even be sustainable on our own anymore. To fight many of these cases, we don't even have the economical power. There are literally families. So to get into the statistics, in Manitoba, Canada, and I say Canada because we never put borders between any of these communities. You have Mohawks in New York and you have Mohawks in Canada. We didn't put these borders here, but in Manitoba, Canada, there are often between 120 and 150 missing person cases a day. And guess how many of them are at 94% Native women? That's like just outrageous. That is enough to just make everyone just be like, wait, how, what? Like, how is that even possible? Like, perhaps maybe some of the ratios in some of these counties are a lot different, right? In Rhode Island, it almost seems unheard of, right? Because the whole point was to make us extinct in the Northeast. We're still there. We're just not there as in large numbers as it would be in what most people call Indian country. And then also what is deemed Indian and what is not deemed Indian. And Rhode Island, or not even just Rhode Island, but for example, I'll say South Carolina, to call for a missing persons case or to even fill out a rape report, there is not always a box for Native people in some of these places on the East Coast. So when you think about that, the statistics that we think that we don't have on the East Coast are because there isn't a place for them to actually be, that data to be captured properly. In particular states like Georgia, there isn't a federally recognized tribe. There are so what a state or the federal government determines to be a tribe, and if a person says they have right to self-determination to say I am, and there isn't a place for me to say that, then that data is lost. So in our minds, and I'm saying our because I am from the Northeast, in our minds, we think, oh, we don't really have that many of these kinds of situations, but we do, and so it's kind of, I guess, there's a lot of work to be done when we think about, how can people help? It's an obligation for those that have their license to help, because there are now, people like myself, people like Ray Two Hawks and many others out there that I'm sure that are watching this, and many of my teachers and peers that are very educated and very astute. But we don't necessarily always have, I guess, that intellectual manpower to really combat such a system, that has literally created laws against us from the time that laws were created. And it's a little hard to say that sometimes because I think it's not said enough. So sometimes I don't really know how I might be perceived by saying the truth, but it is. And so we have now, as of this week, what's been brought to light. And I think because mainly of the technologies that we have, and now that Native people can actually speak English and understand one another, right? Understand, and we can read, and we're actually US citizens. After 1924, we weren't citizens. So all those things that were happening, we weren't deemed as US citizens. We weren't deemed as humans. So these kinds of things were kind of written off of the conscience of the people doing it. And so there's been a story that has kind of blanketed and covered the truth. And that's why it's very hard sometimes for when Native people do speak out, when these marches are had, when you see the hashtag MMIW, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, I think that what happens is people tend to, they don't know, because in their minds, they're thinking, oh, Northeast is just this, you know, it's not the same. Or what's happening here isn't the same. Because when we have conversations about the Northeast, we talk about it in November. We talk about Thanksgiving. You know, we don't really, we kind of talk about Plymouth Rock. We kind of cover up the actual truths. What led to Thanksgiving was Tisquantum being captured and kidnapped. You know, he was one of the people that could actually speak English. He was an interpreter. There were quite a bit of interpreters that were able to come back and do that. And so I think that that's pretty much, you know, when we talk about, you know, the emotional abuse, there is a lot of unresolved grievances. So the connection, right, that women carry, right? So I know it was stated a little earlier, and I think it was great, Stacy, that you had mentioned the topic of, you know, what happens to victims. I think that's you didn't hold back. You said this, you know, you went right with what it is. And when I see and hear all that, I'm like, wow, like I just had to step back. I said, that's a victim, but this is happening to a whole culture of people, like literally, like from the birth of the country, right? From the childhood of the country to where we are today. The Native women have been the brunt of it all. They literally have been raped. When people say raped and pillaged, that was what happened to us. And so now we're at a time where you have women that literally had to endure this and still carry a child. Think about the connection that this woman has, right? We are made up of so much water. What, 85% of us is made up of water, which is why we say women are sacred, and which is why we say water is sacred, because women carry children in their wombs in water. And so when we have to protect that sacred space that child has. But if so much trauma is happening to us, not only in our lifetime, but the lifetimes that we're connected to through an umbilical cord, we're talking about umbilical cord after umbilical cord after umbilical cord after umbilical cord. These women that have carried this are experiencing this and have never had a time to grieve. And so that right there is power and control. It's emotional abuse that's happening to a people. There was mention of, sometimes people are a little hesitant in reaching out to authorities, or, they may not always want to speak up or things like that. And that's due to the lack of the trust that we don't have as a people, unfortunately, because we witnessed 24 of our people be kidnapped in 1608, and nothing has changed since then. And every time we try, because it is who we are as a people, it is, that's who we are, to be in harmony with one another, to be in harmony with the universe, and to be in harmony with the land. So naturally, we're going to be that way. But when these things are, these traumatic things are beginning to happen, and then there's economical abuse happening to the community, then the community members don't always have, I would say, the ability to help, if they will. I have to go to work, or I'll lose my house, or I can't do this because I have to do this, or we're kind of spread all over the place. We're fighting climate change, we're fighting environmental rights, we're protecting our borders. We have all these battles in the entire war, but at the same time, the woman that's being neglected is that Indigenous woman who is to be taking care of the environment. And so when I think of this, I don't really see this as an Indigenous women's issue. I see this as all of our issues, especially those that call themselves American, because this is the history, unfortunately. This week, it's been pretty exciting. The Savannah's Act was passed. For those of you that do not know, the Savannah's Act is the S227. And it is passed the U.S. House of Representatives. So we are at its last leg here. But the Savannah's Act was made because of the missing murdered Indigenous women. But Savannah is a name, and that name is was a woman who was 22 years old, Savannah LaFontaine Graywin. She was 22 years old, and she was 8 months pregnant. And she was murdered. Not only was she murdered, but her child was taken from her out of her stomach. She had gone missing for a week before they found her. And this happened in North Dakota, Fargo, North Dakota. And so this week, and this happened a couple years back, but this week was the passing of that law. And this law will, with hopes of it being enforced, right, will help to actually create a better policy infrastructure for what's happening, to put this on the map. I mean, this has been a silence thing. There's also another act that was passed. It's called the Non-Invisible Act, and that is not necessarily pertaining to missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it's all Indigenous peoples and all peoples, because what's happening is a crisis. I mean, Stacey, you mentioned earlier about the things that are happening to not just women, but all people. I mean, trafficking, rape, domestic violence. Women are vanishing. And these are things that we need to kind of figure out, how can we communicate. And the reason why I think that this act have become so successful and it's kind of come to this point is because the barriers that have been broken down between the communities that we've had up since the beginning of time, right? Like the retaliation that the Patuxent and the Nauset people had, that never quite ended right away. So when people were coming here in the 1600s, they, in their mind, the natives are hostile. So there were always these walls up. And now that we're beginning to be able to communicate with each other over these types of situations, we're actually able to come to hopefully some form of solution. So that's where I think that's how this act has come to be, for it to hopefully be some form of solution in this. And I think that with the resilience of the people, I mean, we have awareness, so much awareness. I mean, there are artists that are dedicating their albums and their tours to missing and murdered Indigenous women. There are runners. There is actually right out of Rhode Island, who is the #1 female middleweight boxer and #2 in the world. And she's actually Wampanoag and Nipmuc, a very close friend of mine. Her name is Kaylee Reese. She's a boxer, and that's her platform, is fighting literally for all nations, but for missing, murdered Indigenous women. And it's people like her and others, authors, artists that are doing different installations, schools, teams, that are really creating awareness, because I don't think that people really know what's happening in this, and the severity of it and the impact that it has, not only on the Native people, because why is it important to protect the Native woman? Let's look at it as a nucleus. If it is a woman, a Native woman, of a people whose job is to protect and sustain the harmony on the earth, then that's going to affect everybody. Because if our waters are polluted, if our land is not able to be grown, if we can't forage, if our air pollution is continuously being the way it is, and the people are removed from that responsibility, and the woman goes vanished, then everyone else is going to be affected. It's a butterfly effect. So that is something that I began to see with the beautiful art and the awareness campaigns. Families, we think about it. I mean, I'm sure many of you have maybe daughters or aunts or mothers or grandmothers, or when you think about like what these families go through, like their child has been gone for years and years and years sometimes. I mean, this has been happening for a long time. More so recently, we're seeing an increase in numbers, but that's probably because the communication is a lot stronger. And so I think that through the Savannah's Act, through the Non-Indivisible Act, and through the network that we have created through this Zoom, but through the relationships and through individual healing. Again, we talk about unresolved grievances. That's not always on the oppressed side. The oppressors also are going through things too. And it is also important that we all begin to heal what these traumas are. I mean, it's traumatic to even just have these conversations all the time. One of the things too with the pro bono work is to understand that Native peoples have wellness teachings in our life ways, what we eat, how we live, how we interact with one another, what we believe, how we interact with the earth. All of these kinds of things are a part of the self-preservation and the self-healing. And when we begin to open up our community to allow others to come in to help us, you began that healing process too as a person. And I think that with what's happening, I mean, as a world with the pandemic, you know, we talk about the pandemic. Let's talk about Patuxent. 1608, back to Thomas Hunt. The pandemic, when Tisquantum came back, 12 years later in 1612, when he came back, his people were gone. There was nothing with bones, Weetus. It was just an abandoned community because of the pandemic that had happened, or the epidemic that had happened to the peoples. Now that might, I mean, yeah. So what happened was that the tribes surrounding, we're still here. We didn't get wiped out. So that means we knew something about quarantining. We knew something about medicines. We knew something about surviving. And so there are teachings that we have that can strengthen the world, but we need help to protect our women and to protect our communities. We need to get rid of the economical abuse. There are tribes that are doing the best that they can to create economical sustainability, Shinnecock including, being right there in the Hamptons and a wealthy community, just like, you know, not too different from the vineyards and the Newport and Jamestown and Cape Cod and, you know, the harbors. It's just the same families for the most part. Historical families, but the tribes are still the same families, but we are still trying to sustain ourselves. We've been pushed into swamps, and historically, I mean, well, recorded that would have been an area for tribes to gain what is called swamp fever, to always be sickly. It was a strategic plan to put tribes in particular areas. And the beautiful thing I'd have to say about the Northeast is that we have never been removed from our areas. A lot of other tribes, unfortunately, and I couldn't even understand the pain of that. Again, those unresolved grievances, that they have been placed from this region to that region, from this region to that region, to this region to that region, to this region to that region. In the Northeast, we have never been removed. You know, we might have diminished in numbers, but we're still strong and we still hold a lot of our traditions. And Roger Williams University, I'm sure, is one of those schools that is very proud of the history of Rhode Island and New England. So, so yeah, that's kind of, I guess, everything that I have to say. I just want to say that as far as, what people can do individually is wherever you are, I would say not only just research, because a lot of people want to sit behind their computer or go to the library and they want to study. They want to study us. The best thing to do is get to know a people, to understand their story from them, to understand what it is that you're strong at that can actually help and aid them in whatever it is. And perhaps maybe there might be something that, you know, we can do. So I just wanted to end with that, and I really appreciate everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanae. At this point, we're going to have a question session. There is already one question posed to Professor Diamond. I copied and pasted that to you in the chat, Professor.
Okay, I'll give it a try. Thank you for first of all, I really appreciate everything Sinead had to say. I would be remiss if I don't, mention it. Certainly mentioning residential schools, we don't talk about that anywhere near enough. The trauma of residential schools and the impact it had on generations of Native peoples, men and women. And we, I know people who went to those schools. It's not a long time ago. It's not ancient history. And so thank you for mentioning that and termination. Let me try to answer the question. Give it a try. Certainly, first of all, talk about Indian law a little bit in that, it really, Sinead mentioned termination. Indian law has, swings with a pendulum back and forth from periods of, cooperation, trust, and good relations, to termination. Let's terminate tribes and Indians and make them go away and make them be invisible. And so the law is inconsistent. But let me talk a little bit, try to talk about, the questioner asked about early times with the British. Well, the British were actually kind of, better to the indigenous people than the settlers were. They thought that land shouldn't be taken away from the Indians without their consent. And so, it started off, more equal footing, and that's why so many tribes sided with the British in the Revolution. And those early agreements, were based on mutual obligations, on trust, and the Indians thought they were sacred. Those agreements were sacred dealings. I have to tell you that the founders, the settlers, were worse to the Indians. There's no other way to look at it. The winners of the Revolutionary War were not as good to the Indians, the settlers wanted the land for colonies and for natural resources. And so, it's an unfortunate history, but so many of our heroes that we're proud of, Thomas Jefferson, who referred to the Indians as merciless savages whose main occupation was war. And President George Washington, who referred to the Indians as, savage as the wolf. Why should we fight these Indian wars when we can just come to these agreements and agreements which took away most of their land. So and then removal that Sinead talked about, Andrew Jackson saying to thousands of Indians, we want this land, so you got to go to Oklahoma, and you have to walk there at gunpoint. So the history is inconsistent. The early U.S. court decisions, federal court decisions, also, treated Indians as, with a limited sovereignty, and it's inconsistent. So you swing back and forth between, protection of inherent sovereignty, sovereignty under natural law, to limited sovereignty that the federal government wants to, take away. Talk about reliance on international law. The questioner talked about reliance on international law. Most certainly, it would be helpful if international human rights played a role in Indian advocacy. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, if that was, was relied upon. There is a special rapporteur for Indigenous peoples at the United Nations who could advocate on behalf of Indigenous people, whether recognized or unrecognized. It's an inconsistent policy, but I think the questioner is asking, Indigenous people have inherent rights. And it's just going to take continual reminding of those with power that Indigenous people do have inherent rights from natural law, that it always existed and exists from time immemorial, continues to exist, and those rights need to be pursued and advocated for. It's an inconsistent history, the pendulum swinging back and forth. But I think if we go back to the way the Indians felt about those agreements, that they were sacred, that they were binding, and that they created mutual obligations of trust, I think it would be a good way to go. Is there another question?
There is, Professor Diamond. I posted it in the chat, but the question is, if law students wanted to create a pro bono project in Rhode Island, what might that look like?
Okay, I think that you need some supervision, and so law students can be supervised by practicing attorneys, and sometimes tribes will reach out to you, and sometimes you reach out to tribes by simply asking, do you need any help? Do you need any help in code writing? Can we help you? Can we help send law students to court, state court, federal court, tribal court as guardians? And that those things are all possible. Whether the lawyers in Rhode Island are working on behalf of tribes, tribal courts, perhaps simply a volunteer line for lawyers who can jump into action and help represent Indigenous and indigent victims or women, or going to court to file for protective orders, whatever it is. I'd certainly be willing to help.
Shanae or Ray, did you want to add anything to those answers?
No, I think the fact that we're even having this conversation and this dialogue is extremely motivating. Having grown up in Rhode Island my entire life and experiencing a lot of the negative side of being an Indigenous person, I'm very encouraged that this event is taking place today with this caliber of participation. And I just love the fact that that's even a question that got posed. What could we do on a pro bono basis here in Rhode Island, and that people are taking it seriously. So I'm just floored by the level of expertise and knowledge that was shared today. And I'm just really excited about what the potential is. But no, I don't have anything specific or direct to suggest at this time.
Shanae, I'm going to give you the final word. Are you still willing to perform a song for us?
Oh, yes. Kind of got caught up in the emotions earlier. I just want to say thank you again to every single person on here, everyone that's watching, everyone that's been tuning in. One thing that's always important is to be able to walk away and maybe take some kind of action. So whether that is action with just doing some research, or whether that is action of just making a phone call, maybe talking to a mentor because you might be stumped. We're never not learning. So the song that I actually want to help close with, and thank you so much, Ray, for opening with my relatives. It's really good to see all of them and hear all of them. I want to close with this song. So the song was actually composed during leave in like 2006, during the walk across Canada, what they call the Canada Trail of Tears. And it's because the women are vanishing. So when they walk, they sing this song, and it's a women's warrior song. So the song is something that women, Indigenous women throughout the country and the world actually sing. So I'd like to sing this song. Yaki yaho, yaki yaho, yaki yo, yaki yo, yaki Yakiyo. Oh, yakiyo. 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 Want to dedicate that song to all of the families, all the mothers, all the fathers, and all the children of the women that are murdered and missing. I want that song to resonate through all of us, to put positive energy into the world and to give them comfort, especially as we come to the winter time. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone for attending. This has truly been a good start to this conversation.
Thank you so much to my presenters, and Janae, that was beautiful. And we're gonna do this again. Woohoo!
Thank you, Raina, for reaching out to the School of Law and for the clinic for making the connection as well. Fantastic work by Roger Williams University School of Law and the District Court. So thank you very much. Katapatush.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
Take
of
care,
course.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You done?